Imagine being 9 years old and someone renames you. Not a nickname, not a mistake on a form. Your birth name, the one your mother whispered to you in a village on the Black Sea coast, or in the hills of Circassia, or in a Balkan town whose bells you can still almost hear, is simply taken away. In its place you're given a new one. Gulbahar, perhaps, Rose of Spring, or Nurbanu, Lady of Light. A beautiful name chosen by a stranger for the girl you are about to become. And from that day for the rest of your life inside those walls, almost no one will ever call you anything else. This happened to thousands of girls, real girls with real mothers who grieved them, sold into a palace most of them would never leave. Hi, friends. Tonight we're going somewhere very few bedtime stories dare to go, behind the gilded doors of the Ottoman imperial harem. Not the version from old paintings, all silk cushions and lazy afternoons. The real one. Slower, stranger, sadder in places, and surprisingly, kinder in others than you might expect, so if you'd like, dim the lights now. Pull the blanket up around your shoulders. Maybe turn on something small and warm in the corner of the room. We're going to spend the next little while inside a world that ran on silence, hierarchy, and an almost unbelievable amount of quiet, careful waiting. Let's begin. You have to understand, first, what the word harem actually meant. Not a room full of lounging women waiting for a sultan's attention. That was a fantasy dreamed up later, mostly by European painters who had never once been allowed inside. The real word, harem, comes from the Arabic haram, meaning forbidden or sacred and protected. It wasn't a pleasure garden. It was the private, guarded, deeply serious household of the sultan. Think of it less like a bedroom and more like an entire walled city within a city, with its own laws, its own economy, its own strict chain of command, and, at its center, one old woman who held more real power than almost anyone in the empire. We'll get to her. But first, you. If you were a girl brought into the Topkapı Palace, Harem in, say, the 16th or 17th century, the odds are very good you didn't choose to be there, and neither did your family, not exactly. Most Karii, the palace's female slaves, arrived through the Devshirme networks, war captures, or the slave markets of Istanbul, often purchased as children from poor families in the Caucasus or the Balkans, where selling a daughter into an imperial household could, harsh as it sounds, be seen as securing her a better life than the one waiting for her at home. A single healthy young girl might be purchased for anywhere between 100 and 300 silver aksay, depending on the decade and her age, a price that, converted into daily labor, was roughly what a skilled craftsman earned in 2 or 3 months of steady work. You were, quite literally, worth a season's wages to whoever brought you in, and then you disappeared from the outside world completely. Picture the moment of arrival: tall gates, cool stone corridors that smelled faintly of rosewater and beeswax candles, the murmur of dozens of unfamiliar female voices somewhere down the hall, and beneath it the constant, distant clink of the fountains that ran through nearly every courtyard, because water, in a place obsessed with privacy, was also the palace's white noise machine, covering conversations from wandering ears. You'd be washed, examined, and handed over to an older woman, called a usta, a mistress, a trainer, who would spend the next several years turning you from a frightened child into a functioning member of a very particular kind of household. The first thing you'd learn was Ottoman Turkish, if you didn't already speak it, because most of these girls arrived speaking Georgian, Circassian, Serbian, Ukrainian, a dozen other tongues, and the harem needed one shared language to run smoothly. The second thing you'd learn was etiquette so precise it bordered on choreography. How to walk without your slippers making a sound on marble, how to serve coffee without a single drop touching the saucer, how to enter a room in an order that reflected exactly how important the person you were entering with was, down to who stepped through the doorway first. And the third thing, the thing nobody wrote down in official records, but every girl absorbed within her first few weeks, was where you stood, because the harem, more than almost anything else, was a hierarchy. A tall, narrow, unforgiving ladder, and everyone inside it knew, instinctively, which rung they occupied. At the very top sat the Valid Sultan, literally Mother Sultan. The reigning sultan's own mother, and without exaggeration, one of the most powerful women in the entire empire. She had her own household staff, her own income, her own throne-adjacent apartments, and very often the sultan's genuine, lifelong obedience. Some Valid sultans quietly ran foreign policy. Some corresponded directly with the doges of Venice and the Serenas of Russia. It's a strange, lovely little detail of history that for long stretches of the 16th and 17th centuries, the most influential diplomat in Istanbul might have been a woman almost no European ambassador was ever permitted to see. Below her came the Khadin, the Sultan's official consorts, mothers of his children, each one ranked by the order in which she'd borne him a son. Below them the Iqbal, women who had caught the Sultan's favor but hadn't yet risen to full consort status. Below them the Guzd, the noticed one, a woman singled out once, maybe only once, for the Sultan's attention. And beneath all of them, forming the vast majority of the harem's population, the ordinary Karai, hundreds of women, at some points in Topkapi's history, close to 400 or 500 at once, who spent their days not anywhere near the Sultan at all, but cooking, sewing, cleaning, playing music, keeping the enormous machinery of the household turning. Here's the detail that tends to surprise people most. The overwhelming majority of women in any sultan's harem never met him. Not once. Not even from across a room. You could live inside those walls for 20 years, grow old there, be buried in the palace cemetery, and never once lay eyes on the household you'd spent your whole adult life serving. The harem wasn't primarily a collection of romantic partners. It was, first and always, a labor force, an enormous, tightly run domestic operation, staffed almost entirely by women, guarded by eunuchs, and administered with the seriousness of a small state. Speaking of guards, you could hear them before you saw them most nights. Soft-soled shoes on stone. The black eunuchs of the Kızlar Agası, the chief of the girls, moving unhurried through the corridors after dark, checking doors, checking silence, checking that the 1,000 small rules of the household were holding. Many of these men had been brought from East Africa as boys, castrated before puberty specifically, so they could occupy this singular, strange position of trust, close enough to serve the most intimate parts of imperial life, barred by law and by body from ever threatening the succession. The chief eunuch, by the height of Ottoman power, controlled a personal fortune, oversaw the palace's religious endowments, and answered, some said, to no one but the Valid Sultan and the Sultan himself. Not bad, for a man history mostly remembers as a background detail in someone else's story. A day inside the harem had its own gentle, exhausting rhythm. You'd wake before dawn for the first prayer. Then hours of work, training in music, calligraphy, dance, needlework, depending on your talents and your usta's assessment of you. Because a palace this size ran almost entirely on the skilled labor of its own women. The hammam, the bathhouse, wasn't a leisure activity so much as a maintenance ritual, sometimes taking 2 or 3 hours, filled with steam, the soft slap of wet cloth on marble, low laughter, and, this part is true, and somehow very human, plenty of gossip. Whatever else the harem was, it was also hundreds of women living in extremely close quarters for years at a stretch, and they gossiped exactly like people anywhere else would. Meals were modest and communal for most Karai. Bread, yogurt, seasonal vegetables, meat only a few times a week, even for a household this wealthy, because Ottoman court cuisine reserved its most elaborate dishes for ceremonial occasions, not daily eating. And in the evenings, once the work slowed, there was music. Real music. The harem produced some of the era's most accomplished female composers and instrumentalists, women whose names rarely left the palace walls, but whose skill, by every account, rivaled the finest court musicians in Europe. It was, in other words, a life built almost entirely around waiting. Waiting to be noticed, waiting to be promoted, or married off to a palace official as a reward for years of service, or, if you were very fortunate, very skilled, and very patient, waiting to eventually run a household of your own within those walls. Still frightened, still far from home, still hopeful, in her own quiet way. But there was one part of the hierarchy nobody spoke of loudly, even inside the harem itself. A rule so absolute that breaking it meant the Bosphorus at midnight, and no one ever asked questions afterward. Here is what the servants whispered about, in low voices, mostly at night, mostly to warn the newest girls. That the harem's most sacred law wasn't about faith, or duty, or even the Sultan himself. It was about privacy, absolute, unbreakable privacy. And the punishment for shattering it was the one story every Carrie had heard before she'd been in the palace even a month. The rumor, and historians still argue about how often it was actually true, versus how often it simply served as a useful piece of folklore to keep 400 women quiet, was this: that a girl caught in a serious transgression, an affair with a palace guard, an attempt to smuggle a message to the outside world, might be sewn into a weighted sack and quietly lowered into the waters of the Bosphorus at night. No trial, no public record, no grave anyone could visit. Just an empty bed the next morning, and a silence so complete that even asking about it felt dangerous. Whether this happened often, rarely, or mostly existed as a story told to keep obedience high, we may never know for certain. The Ottoman court didn't keep records of its own worst-kept secrets, but real or half-real, it tells you something true and important about the palace. Everything about it, every rule, every gesture, every closed door was built around one idea. What happens inside these walls stays inside these walls, forever. So let's settle back in, get comfortable again, and gently step past that shadow. Because most days in the harem had nothing to do with danger at all. Most days were small, quiet, almost boring in the sweetest sense of the word. And that's really where we left off, isn't it? Hundreds of women, waiting, as it turns out, for something very specific, a handkerchief. You've probably heard some version of this legend, that the Sultan would simply drop a handkerchief in front of the woman he'd chosen for the night, and that would be that. It's a lovely, tidy little image, and like most lovely, tidy images from the harem, it's mostly invented. What actually happened was slower, more bureaucratic, and, honestly, a little funnier once you know the details. Any meeting between the Sultan and a Karai had to be arranged, scheduled, and supervised, usually by the Kislar Agassi, or by senior women of the household, acting almost like appointment secretaries for the most intimate part of imperial life. A girl who caught the Sultan's eye at a music performance in a courtyard during a ceremonial procession where the harem women might briefly glimpse him from behind a screen would have her name quietly noted. Then she'd wait, sometimes weeks. Sometimes she was never called at all and simply went on with her needlework, her music lessons, her small daily rhythms, the moment folded away like a letter never sent. If she was called, the actual evening was, by every surviving account, almost comically formal. She'd be bathed, perfumed, dressed by other women of the harem, who, we can only assume, had opinions about the whole business, whispered between themselves while pinning up her hair. She'd be escorted through the palace by torchlight to the Sultan's private quarters, and even then, she wouldn't simply walk in and sit down. Tradition held that she should enter from the foot of his bed and approach respectfully. A piece of etiquette so specific it's almost sweet. Imagine training for months in music and needlework and language, only to also need choreography for this single, nervous walk across a room. And here's the detail that quietly undercuts the entire fantasy version of harem life. Becoming a favorite wasn't really about being chosen for one evening. It was about what came after. A Karai who bore the Sultan a son didn't just gain his affection. She gained a title, her own apartments, her own household staff, and, most importantly, a permanent stake in the empire's future. Because in the Ottoman system, unlike most of Europe, it wasn't the eldest son who was guaranteed to inherit. It was whichever son proved strong enough, clever enough, or simply lucky enough to outmaneuver his brothers when the old Sultan finally died. Which meant that every mother in that hierarchy, Kadun, Iqbal, ordinary Karai alike, was playing a much longer, much more serious game than romance. She was raising a potential future ruler of one of the largest empires on earth, and everyone around her knew it. The tenderness of motherhood and the cold calculus of succession politics lived, uncomfortably, in the very same nursery. It's why the harem's real power players usually weren't the youngest, prettiest girls at all. The ones later European travelers loved to paint lounging on cushions, but the older, sharper women who'd spent decades learning exactly how the machine worked. Women like the one we'll spend real time with 2 sections from now. A red-haired Ruthenian slave girl who arrived with no name anyone remembers and left history as one of the most powerful women the empire ever produced. But her story needs context first. Because to understand how far a carrier could rise, you first have to understand just how far a prince could fall, and how the empire's solution to too many royal sons was, by any measure, one of the strangest and saddest customs in the entire Ottoman world. For much of the empire's early history, the rule was chillingly simple. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers did not survive him for long. Fratricide, the killing of one's own brothers, was formalized under Sultan Mehmed II into something close to actual law, justified in his own words as necessary for the order of the world. A newly crowned sultan might have 5, 6, 7 half-brothers, sons of different mothers from different corners of the harem hierarchy, each one a living threat to civil war. And so, within days of a coronation, it wasn't unusual for silk cords to be sent quietly to a series of young rooms across the palace. Imagine being one of those mothers. Spending years raising a son inside the safest, most heavily guarded walls in the empire, and knowing, the entire time, gently quietly in the back of your mind, that his own survival might one day depend entirely on which brother sat on the throne first. By the 17th century, the empire had softened this custom into something almost as strange. Instead of killing royal brothers outright, they were simply locked away. The cafes, literally, the cage, was a secluded set of apartments within Topkapı, where princes not currently in line for immediate succession lived out their entire lives. Comfortable, certainly, well-fed, educated, attended by servants, but confined, sometimes for decades, never permitted to marry, rarely permitted visitors, waiting in gilded stillness for a throne that for most of them would never actually come. Some princes emerged from the cafes after 30 or 40 years of confinement to rule an empire they barely understood, having spent their entire adult lives inside 4 walls and a walled garden. It's a strange, quiet kind of tragedy, isn't it? That the very system built to protect the empire from chaos ended up trapping its own princes in a kind of golden, comfortable, endless waiting room. Not so different, in its own way, from the women just one courtyard over, also waiting, also golden, also confined, still golden, still confined, still waiting for a life that might never quite arrive. But not every woman who entered that hierarchy simply waited her whole life away. One did something almost no Karai before her had ever managed. She rewrote the rules of the entire system from the inside, and by the time she was finished, foreign ambassadors weren't writing home about the Sultan anymore. They were writing home about her. They called her Hürrem, the cheerful one, the laughing one. And by the time she died, she had done something no Karai in the empire's long history had managed before her. She had married the Sultan, not become his favorite, not simply borne him sons, married him, broken a 200-year unspoken rule that sultans did not wed their concubines, and done it so completely that afterward nobody quite remembered why the rule had existed in the first place. Her real name is lost to us now, swallowed up like so many others the moment she crossed the threshold into Topkapı. What we know is that she was likely Ruthenian, from a region in what is now western Ukraine, probably the daughter of an Orthodox priest, captured in a Tatar raid sometime in her early teens, and sold through the Crimean slave markets into the Ottoman court. One version of history has her arriving around 1520, a red-headed, freckled, unusually striking girl in a harem more accustomed to dark-haired daughters of the Caucasus. Europeans who later heard rumors of her called her Roxolana, the Ruthenian woman. A nickname that outlived almost every other detail we have about her early life. What made her different wasn't just her appearance, though contemporary accounts do dwell on it. Pale skin, red gold hair, an unusual liveliness in a household that prized quiet composure. What made her different was that Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the longest reigning and most powerful sultans the empire ever produced, simply never seemed to grow tired of her. Most sultans moved through dozens of consorts over a reign. Suleiman, by every surviving account, spent nearly 4 decades devoted almost entirely to one woman. Picture it slowly, the way it must have actually unfolded. Not a single dramatic moment, but years of small ones. A sultan who kept returning to the same apartments, the same conversations, the same laugh, long after the political usefulness of any one consort would normally have faded. Letters survive. Real letters, tender and surprisingly plain-spoken. Suleiman writing to Hürrem while away on campaign, calling her his sultana of my heart, his moonlight, describing himself as a man made restless by her absence. It's a strange, gentle thing to hold in your mind. One of the most powerful men on earth, commanding armies across 3 continents, coming home at night and writing love letters to a woman who'd arrived in his household as property. And Hürrem, for her part, did not simply enjoy this affection quietly from the sidelines. She used it, carefully, patiently, over years, to rebuild the entire architecture of her own life within the palace. The first rule she broke was the rule of the single favorite. Ottoman custom generally held that a consort who bore the Sultan a son should then step back from his bed, her purpose fulfilled, freeing him to father sons with other women and spread the succession risk across several mothers. Hürrem didn't step back. She stayed and kept bearing him children, 5 sons and a daughter in total, an extraordinary number for a single consort under this system, each birth quietly strengthening her position rather than ending it. The second rule she broke was leaving the harem behind entirely. In 1534, after the death of Suleiman's mother, Hürrem did something almost unheard of. She had her manumission papers drawn up, formally freeing her from slave status, and then married Suleiman in a public ceremony celebrated with weeks of festivities across Istanbul. A former slave girl, legally free, legally wed, standing beside the Sultan in a role no Karai had held before her, and few would hold quite the same way after. And the third rule, the quietest, and in some ways the most consequential, was that she never moved out of the palace and into her own separate residence, as most married consorts eventually did. She stayed inside Topkapı itself, close to the seat of power, close to the Sultan's daily rhythms, in a way that let her presence in imperial affairs become something closer to permanent than any woman before her had achieved. Foreign ambassadors noticed, and their letters home tell you everything about how unusual this all was. The Venetian envoy Navaggero wrote with something between fascination and alarm about a woman who seemed to command more genuine influence over Suleiman than any of his advisors. Other diplomatic reports describe her corresponding directly with the King of Poland, receiving foreign dignitaries, funding the construction of mosques, public baths, and soup kitchens across the empire in her own name. The kind of large-scale religious philanthropy usually reserved for sultans and their mothers, not for consorts, and certainly not for former slaves. It's worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it's easy to breeze past. A girl taken from her family as a teenager, stripped of her name, sold into a household as property, ends her life having personally funded some of the grandest public architecture in Istanbul. Buildings that, in some cases, are still standing today, still in use, still quietly bearing her name. History rarely offers such a clean arc. Hürrem's is one of the closest things to it, but her story also has a darker current running beneath the romance, and it would be gentle to skip past it, but not entirely honest, because the same patience and political skill that let her rise so far also, most historians now believe, helped bring down a rival she could not allow to remain standing. His name was Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son, born to an earlier consort named Mahidevran, and by every account a capable, popular young prince, well liked by the Janissary corps, and widely expected to inherit the throne over Hürrem's own sons. In the Ottoman succession system we talked about earlier, where the strongest son wins, not simply the eldest, Mustafa represented a serious, looming threat to her own children's futures. In 1553, after years of court intrigue, whispered accusations, and letters historians still debate the authorship of, Suleiman had his own son Mustafa executed by strangulation in the Sultan's own military camp on suspicion of plotting rebellion. Hürrem's exact role in engineering, that suspicion remains genuinely disputed among historians to this day. Some see her hand clearly in it. Others urge caution about assigning blame across 4 centuries of second-hand rumor. But contemporaries certainly believed she was involved, and the belief alone was enough to make her, for the rest of her life, one of the most feared women in the empire, admired and resented in almost equal measure. It's a strange thing, isn't it, to hold both truths gently at once. The woman who funded soup kitchens for the poor of Istanbul, and the woman contemporaries whispered had a prince strangled to protect her sons. Perhaps that's simply what surviving that particular hierarchy required. Kindness in the parts of life where kindness was safe to show, and something far colder in the one arena, succession, where softness could cost you, and every child you'd ever born. Hürrem died in 1558, nearly a decade before Suleiman himself, and he was, by every account, devastated by the loss, in a way that surprised even those closest to him. He commissioned an extraordinary mausoleum for her, within the grounds of the Süleymaniye Mosque, its interior tiled in blue and white Iznik ceramics, a small, quiet, breathtakingly beautiful resting place for a woman who'd begun her life in an entirely different country under an entirely different name. Still remembered, still powerful, still just a little bit feared, centuries after her voice went quiet. But Hürrem wasn't the last woman to master this particular game. In fact, the very system she helped reshape, consorts wielding real influence, mothers guarding sons' futures, would eventually produce an era so defined by powerful harem women that later historians gave it its own uneasy nickname, one that makes it sound at first far more sinister than it perhaps deserves. Historians gave this era an unflattering nickname, one that sounds almost like an accusation: the Kadunlar Sultanati, the Sultanate of Women. For nearly a century after Hürrem, spanning roughly the 1550s through the 1650s, a remarkable string of valid sultans and powerful consorts didn't simply influence the empire from behind a curtain. They ran a great deal of it directly, appointing grand viziers, negotiating with foreign powers, funding armies, and, in a few extraordinary cases, ruling almost as regents in all but title, while young or weak-willed sultans occupied the throne in name only. It's worth pausing on that nickname for a moment, because it tells you something about who was doing the naming. Male chroniclers of the time, uneasy watching so much real power gather in women's hands, framed this era as a kind of decline. Proof, they suggested, that the empire had gone soft, distracted, unmanly. Modern historians tend to see it rather differently. Not a corruption of Ottoman governance, but simply what happens when you build a system where the mother of the heir holds genuine institutional power, and then that system runs for a century with unusually capable women occupying that role. Consider Hürrem Sultan, one of the era's towering figures, a woman likely of Greek origin, who served as Valid Sultan not once but effectively across the reigns of 2 of her own sons and, briefly, her young grandson, wielding regency-level authority for the better part of 3 decades. She oversaw treasury decisions, met with ambassadors, and by most contemporary accounts, held more day-to-day command over imperial affairs than either of the sultans technically ruling beside her. Her end, when it came, was as ruthless as the politics she'd mastered for 30 years. Strangled in 1651, in a palace power struggle with her own daughter-in-law, another Valid sultan determined not to share the throne's shadow with anyone. Even in a hierarchy built partly around women's mutual solidarity, the very top rung, it turns out, only ever had room for one. And that's really the quiet thread running through this entire story, isn't it? From the nameless 9-year-old girl we met at the very start of tonight's journey, to Hürrem funding soup kitchens with one hand, and reportedly unseating a prince with the other, to Kösem ruling an empire from behind a curtain for 30 years before her own household turned on her. This was never simply a world of victims, And never simply a world of villains either. It was something far more complicated and far more human. Hundreds of women, most of them arriving with nothing, building whatever power, whatever safety, whatever small daily dignity they could, inside a system that had taken almost everything else from them, the moment they walked through those gates. Some spent their whole lives waiting in quiet corners, and found something like peace there. Some clawed their way to the very top, and paid for it in ways their letters home never mentioned. Most were somewhere in between, a needlework lesson finished well, a promotion to a slightly nicer set of rooms, a friendship in the Harem that made the years feel a little less long. Small victories, human ones, the kind that rarely make it into history books, but were, for the women living them, the whole shape of a life. It's getting late now, wherever you're listening from. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your breathing slow. Think back, if you can, to that girl we started with tonight, 9 years old, given a new name at the palace gates, frightened and far from home. Somewhere in a quiet corner of that vast water-hushed palace, she's still there in a way. Older now in our imagination. Perhaps she's an Usta herself, decades later, gently correcting a new girl's posture the way someone once corrected hers. Perhaps she never rose far at all, and simply found a kind of steady, ordinary peace in the small rhythms of harem life. The fountains, the hammam steam, the music lessons on quiet afternoons. Either way she made it through. Still tired some nights, still far from the home she remembers, but still here, and in her own quiet, hard-won way, still hers. That's where we'll leave the Ottoman harem tonight. Not with the fantasy of it, and not only with its sorrow, but with the truth somewhere gently in between. A world of silk and slavery, hierarchy and quiet friendship, cruelty and unexpected kindness, all folded together behind walls built to keep every bit of it a secret. If this story kept you company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, but only if it felt worth it. No pressure at all. Rest well. Let the fountains keep running somewhere far off in your mind, and let yourself finally drift off to sleep.